Episode 74. Is mainstream media controlled by 6 corporations, and does it matter? Welcome back to the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. In 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 different companies. Today, that same 90% is controlled by 6. That is not a conspiracy theory. It is a documented fact, confirmed by the Committee to Protect Journalists, by media researchers, and by the corporations themselves. 6 companies: Comcast, Walt Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Paramount Skydance, Sony, and Amazon own the television networks, the film studios, the streaming platforms, the publishing houses, the radio stations, and the cable news channels that shape what the majority of people in the English-speaking world read, watch, and hear. The question tonight is not whether this consolidation happened. It did. The question is what it means, whether concentrated media ownership is simply an economic reality with limited consequences, or whether it represents something more concerning for the quality of information in democratic societies. Detailed explanation: the story of media consolidation in the United States has a specific turning point. In 1996, President Bill Clinton signed the Telecommunications Act, a piece of legislation that dramatically loosened the restrictions on how many media outlets a single company could own. Before 1996, ownership rules limited concentration. After, the wave of mergers and acquisitions that created the current landscape became possible and, given the financial logic of scale, essentially inevitable. The consolidation has continued in 2025 and 2026. The Paramount Global and Skydance media merger was approved by the FCC in 2025. Comcast spun off most of its NBC Universal cable networks into a new company called Versant at the end of 2025. The Tegna-Nexstar merger, approved by the FCC in March 2026, created a single broadcast company covering 80% of U.S. television-watching households. In parallel, the ownership structures of these companies have become entangled with technology and billionaire interests in new ways. Oracle's control of TikTok's U.S. operations gives a single individual, Larry Ellison, access to one of the most powerful content algorithms on Earth, alongside the Skydance-Paramount merger, giving his son influence over CBS News. Amazon's acquisition of MGM Studios and its Prime Video platform makes it both a retailer and a media producer. The lines between technology companies, retail platforms, and news organizations have blurred to the point where separating them is genuinely difficult. Local news has been the most visible casualty of consolidation. Over 2,000 U.S. counties, more than 60%, now lack a daily newspaper. The journalists who once covered local government, school boards, and city councils are largely gone, creating information deserts where communities have no independent coverage of the institutions that most directly affect their lives. Core elements of the concern: the first element is the conflict of interest problem. Media corporations that also own defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, financial institutions, and political lobbying operations face structural conflicts when covering stories that affect those interests. An investigative report that damages a major advertiser or a fellow subsidiary is not in the financial interest of the parent company. These pressures do not require explicit editorial orders. They operate through culture, incentive, and the simple fact of who owns what. The second element is interlocking directorates. Board members of major media companies frequently also sit on the boards of banks, oil companies, pharmaceutical firms, healthcare companies, and technology corporations. This network of shared governance creates relationships of mutual interest that make truly adversarial journalism, the kind that challenges powerful institutions, structurally more difficult. The third element is the homogenization of coverage. When 50 companies become 6, the range of perspectives, editorial priorities, and story selections narrows. Stories that all 6 companies choose not to cover receive no mainstream coverage. Topics that serve the interests of concentrated corporate ownership receive more sympathetic framing. The fourth element is the regulatory capture concern. These 6 corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars annually on lobbying. The FCC, which is responsible for regulating broadcast media ownership, has approved merger after merger, including the Tegna-Nexstar deal that now gives one company coverage of 80% of U.S. television households. Critics argue the regulatory body meant to prevent excessive concentration has instead enabled it. Evidence for and against the evidence that media consolidation has occurred and is accelerating is not disputed. The numbers are documented. The mergers are public record. The death of local news is measurable. The lobbying expenditures are filed publicly. The interlocking directorates are on record. The evidence that consolidation produces coordinated editorial suppression, that the 6 corporations actively collaborate to shape narratives in their collective interest, is more contested. Most media researchers draw a distinction between structural bias, the tendency of corporate media to reflect corporate interests through incentives and culture, and conspiratorial coordination, explicit agreement between competitors to suppress specific stories. The former is well documented. The latter is difficult to establish. Defenders of mainstream media consolidation argue that competitive pressures between the 6 corporations actually produce vigorous news coverage, and that the rise of independent media, podcasting, and online journalism has created more diverse information sources than existed in the broadcast era. They point to the fact that investigative journalism that damages powerful interests, including stories about these very corporations, still gets published regularly. Critics counter that the most consequential stories are precisely the ones that don't get covered, and that absence is by nature invisible. Argument in favor of concerned believers in the coordinated control theory argue that the financial interests of 6 corporations are sufficiently aligned, particularly on matters of regulation, taxation, trade, and political stability, that coordination is not necessary. When 6 companies with shared interests all employ editors and producers who understand those interests, the result is structural alignment that produces the same effect as explicit coordination without requiring it. They point to specific documented cases, stories that were killed after advertiser pressure, investigations that were buried after executive interference, and the systematic underreporting of issues that threaten corporate or advertiser interests, as evidence that the structural concern is not theoretical but operational. Arguments against skeptics argue that the 6 corporations claim, while broadly accurate, overstates the degree of editorial control any single entity has over the complex organizations within these conglomerates. CNN, NBC News, and CBS News operate with substantial editorial independence from their parent companies in day-to-day journalism. Reporters pursue stories that embarrass powerful interests regularly. The theory of unified corporate narrative control does not adequately explain the frequency with which the mainstream media publishes stories that are damaging to major corporations and political allies of those corporations. They also note that trust in mainstream media has declined most sharply at precisely the moment when alternative media, social platforms, podcasts, independent journalism has proliferated. If the 6 corporations controlled the information environment, the migration of audiences away from them would not be possible at the scale it has occurred. Public opinion and broader impact trust in mainstream media is at historic lows in 2026 across most Western democracies. This distrust is not uniformly distributed. It varies by political affiliation, age, and country, but the trend is consistent and significant. Surveys show that large portions of the population believe the media does not cover important stories, reflects the interests of the powerful rather than the public, and cannot be trusted to report without bias. Whether that distrust is a rational response to documented concentration and structural bias, a product of deliberate campaigns to undermine credible journalism, or some combination of both, is itself one of the most consequential questions in democratic life. Conclusion: is mainstream media controlled by 6 corporations? Yes. The consolidation is documented and the trend is continuing. Whether that control translates into coordinated narrative management or something more diffuse and structural is where the debate lives. For believers in the conspiracy version, the 6 corporations are the mechanism of elite information control, a private infrastructure for shaping public perception in the interests of the powerful. For skeptics, concentrated ownership creates genuine structural problems for journalism without rising to the level of coordinated editorial suppression. What is certain is this. In 1983, 50 companies owned 90% of American media. Today, 6 do. And one company now covers 80% of U.S. television households. Whether you call that a conspiracy or a market outcome, the result is the same. This is the Conspiracy Theory Analyst. I'm Robin. If tonight's episode made you think, please rate and follow on Spotify. Tomorrow on the Conspiracy Theory Analyst, Kurt Cobain. Suicide. Or was Nirvana's frontman murdered? That's next.